All right, it's 2 minutes past. We have quite a few people in here, so I guess we can get started. Let me just adjust my view. And where's my thing? All right. Yeah, so we can go ahead and get started. I am really excited to introduce our guest speaker today. So thank you everybody for joining us. Today we have Dr. Felix Thoemmes. He's an associate professor of human development and psychology at Cornell. He's lived, as we've been chatting, all over the place and has, I think, lots of interesting stories to tell about Germany and the US. But today he's going to be talking about mediation. His area of specialty is causal inference, so SEM and also open science. And we're really excited to learn what he has to say about mediation and causal inference and how we can best analyze our data. And he's published on many really impactful journals about this topic and has led several grant-funded projects to conduct research on how we can best analyze our data. And today he'll share some of his insights. Just as a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask questions, so not the regular chat. You can ask questions anonymously using the Q&A, and you can also upvote the questions that you like. So we've set aside some time at the end of the seminar for questions and answers and discussion. If there's something really pressing, we can get to it in the middle of it, but we'll take time at the end to answer all of the questions. And just remember that the chat and the Q&A are visible to everybody, so please be kind and courteous. And before I take any more time, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. I've seen RIOTS talks advertised on my Twitter timeline many times, and I saw the types of topics and the types of folks that speak on those. So when Jonathan emailed me whether I would be willing to participate, I immediately jumped to it because it's a cool talk series that you have to hear. So as Jonathan already mentioned, I'm going to be talking about mediation analysis, and I in fact have to thank him for the title of this. I kind of knew what I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't sort of put it into a small punchy title, and Jonathan brainstormed one morning with me and I think gave me 10 different potential titles to choose from, and I chose this one. So I'm going to be talking about this deceptively simple trivariate model. We have some putative cause X, some mechanism mediator M, and some outcome Y. And the associated paths between these three variables, alpha, beta, gamma prime, sometimes also called A, B, C prime. And even though it's just three variables, there is almost seems like there's a whole career of research to be made just with three variables. And my previous co-advisor, Dave McKinnon at Arizona State University, has done just that. He spent his whole career on these three variables. The overarching thesis of my talk I'd like to convince you of, or maybe you are already convinced and then you're just sort of being reinforced in your beliefs, is that first and foremost, there is no such thing as descriptive mediation. A mediation model is necessarily always a postulated causal model. That's an important point that I want to emphasize during this talk. And as a causal model, and that is true for all causal models, it must rest on often untestable assumptions that need to be expressed and defended by the person who makes them. And as I'm also trying to convince you, is that statistical tests have very limited ability to distinguish these alternative causal models. That ability is not zero, but it is very close to zero, especially in the case of the trivariate mediation model. Before I dive into these main points, I sort of want to make sure that I don't come across as saying there's no value in descriptive work. There is. In fact, descriptive work is necessary, it is important, and it is a part of psychological science. However, when we often conduct descriptive studies, we basically say, well, we're studying these two variables, X and Y, and it's purely descriptive. We don't talk about any sort of causal inference. It's really a shorthand of saying that we are agnostic to the underlying causal structure. And that it could be, as you see here on my screen, X causing Y, or Y causing X, or X and Y that's here in the middle being caused by some unobserved third variable through the bidirected arrow, or a combination of these. So all of these are possible. And when we say we're only doing descriptive work, we're basically saying we don't commit to one of these 5 possible structures in the case of just 2 variables. However, every time that we draw a mediation model, that we compute an indirect effect, we're actually staking our feet to a particular causal model. And that's why I was making that statement that there is no such thing as descriptive mediation. So sometimes you hear or read people, they use the mediation model, but they say, well, but it wasn't randomized, so this is purely descriptive. And that, I don't think, is a sensible stance to take. Once you've committed to a particular model, mediation model, once you've drawn the arrows and computed the associate path coefficients, you have committed yourself to a model like this. And sort of the issue with that is that once you've done this, your data actually support a whole host of other equivalent models just as much. This is this concept of the equivalence class, sometimes also referred to as the Markov equivalence class. I showed you the Markov equivalence class of 2 variables just a slide ago. It turns out that just adding a third variable and then allowing or assuming the presence of both directed and bidirected arrows in this trivariate model yields 125 different causal models. Not all of them are estimable. They're essentially not identified. If we restrict ourselves to the ones that are just identified, then we have 27 of them. And you also see a tiny little asterisk next to the 125 because it includes also cyclic models. So if you, for example, a model in which X causes M, M causes Y, and Y causes X again. Typically, we sort of rule them out on theoretical grounds that the sort of last arrow that closes the cycle would be some causation backwards in time. Typically, outside sort of a weird quantum phenomena, we basically assume that this is impossible, it doesn't exist. So if you would like to, you could subtract 16 models from this 125, but that's still a lot of models. And all of these models are, whether you realize this or not, equally supported by your data. And they cannot be distinguished using statistics. And this is important because these different causal models obviously have vastly different theoretical implications. It makes a huge difference whether the arrow goes from M to Y or Y to M. It would sort of completely turn your theory upside down if this were the case. So I want to show you in sort of some detail of how this equivalence class looks like, and also why statistics cannot help. But at this point here, I just want you to sort of be aware of the fact that every time that you commit yourself to a particular mediation model, you're ruling out a whole lot of other equally supported models. The first piece that I want to dive in now much deeper is that of statistical indistinguishability, basically the equivalence class. And I want to motivate it by showing you a paper that was published in Psychological Science, obviously one of our flagship journals within the field. And I'm showing you now the first page, and just sort of as a disclaimer, I'm not doing this to knock on a particular set of authors. In fact, I don't know the authors of this study, and sort of don't want to sort of publicly shame them or anything. I'm sure I could have picked other papers too. The only reason I picked this paper is that it was published relatively recent, even though it's now almost 7 years, 2015, in one of our best journals. So it is a paper about an experiment in which people were either put on a stable chair or a wobbly chair. And the thesis of the paper was that the wobbly chair induces feelings of instability in your life, including instability about your relationship when being asked for that, which then in turn has some downstream impact on relationship quality, how sort of satisfied you are with the relationship. I'm not going to sort of talk about whether this sort of paradigm or this theory is sensible or not, that sort of this essentially embodied cognition. I'm only using this study because they conducted a mediation analysis. I want to highlight two pieces of their paper that are marked here in yellow. So the authors did a mediation analysis. They found a significant indirect effect. They described the indirect effect. And then the second highlighted part in yellow is where they talk about that a model in which the order of what is now here the mediator and y was reversed did not yield a significant indirect effect. So they had their mediation model, they found an indirect effect, then they flipped one of the errors, then they didn't find an indirect effect, and then they conclude, thus, physical instability led people to perceive the relationship to be less likely to last. And then a couple pages later, they have another model in study 2. Again, they find a significant indirect effect. And then the second yellow part, they say a model in which the order was reversed also yielded a significant indirect effect. And now they conclude, therefore, the present data do not enable us to distinguish whether general uncertainty might contribute to or follow from perceived relationship instability. And just to give the punchline away, this type of procedure in which you use the significance of certain path coefficients, or here the significance of the indirect effect, to distinguish between, in this case, two different mediation models, is unfortunately completely invalid. It's absolutely impossible to flip an arrow, then look at certain path coefficients, and then declare one model wins over the other because this one had a significant effect and this one didn't. And again, this is from 2015. I don't know how widespread it is now, 7 years later. I certainly still sort of hear and see about it here and there. And the fact that these models are identical, I'm not the first person to say this. So Dave McKinnon, I've mentioned him earlier, in the year 2000 in prevention science already talked about here the equivalence of mediation, confounding, and suppression. So it's 3 different models that he looked at. Likewise, Klaus Fiedler in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology and colleagues in a paper, What Mediation Analysis Cannot Do, talked about what he referred to as the empirical indistinguishability because of mathematical model equivalence. He also looked at just 3 models. But I still felt compelled then in the year 2015 to write a paper aptly titled Reversing Errors in Mediation Models Does Not Distinguish Plausible Models. And I can sort of tell you the story how I sort of felt compelled to write it. I remember it was back in 2014, which feels like an eternity ago now. A grad student came to my office and she just gotten reviews for a journal submission, and she told me, well, the editor wants me to reverse the arrows in my mediation model to see whether the opposite direction also works or doesn't. And she was unsure whether she should be doing this or not. And I told her it doesn't really make sense, and maybe you can sort of cite McKinnon 2000, it's sort of close enough, and she sort of went from there. And I just sort of went on with my life. And then just a couple of days later, a colleague, another professor, came in my office, and he was reviewing a paper. And he said, well, it's anonymous peer review, but I know that group. It's a bunch of guys from Harvard, and they are doing this mediation model, and then they're reversing the error, and I'm just not so sure whether this is correct or not. And again, I told him, makes sense. You can't. It doesn't help you in determining which model is better or not. And it was at this point, and maybe it was just sort of the happenstance, that this happened just sort of a few days in between, that I felt like apparently it still needs to be said in some paper. And it just also then happened that the journal Basic and Applied Social Psych, which is sort of not a super prominent journal, had like a special call for papers on mediation analysis. I was like, you know what, the stars aligned. I want to write this. So what we tried to do in this paper is to really highlight the importance of the equivalence class. That the equivalence class always exists when you postulate a causal model and is defined as a class of models that have the exact same support from the data. And what is so often, I guess, confusing to maybe applied psychologists who haven't been sort of exposed to that thinking about the equivalence class is that these models have the exact same constraints on the covariance matrix. They have the exact same model implied covariance matrix. They have the exact same fit indices. In the case of mediation models, typically those are just identified models, so they all have perfect fit to the data anyway. But they have different path coefficients. And that is just sort of so, it's tough to grasp. It's basically, look, these two models, they have different path coefficients. Some of them are significant here and some are not significant over there. And yet you say these two models have the same support from the data. That's sort of, it's kind of tough to swallow because you sort of immediately feel like, look how different they are. How can these models support the data the same way? Or how can these models be supported by the data the same way? Yet they are. Let me give you one single example of how this type of thinking that you can use statistics to distinguish between true and false models can lead you astray. This is just one cherry-picked example, and I promise you after this one cherry-pick, I'll show you the whole universe of models and how it still leads you astray. So here's a true model, and we know it's true because we generate it in a computer. We say that there's a variable x that has an effect on m that's relatively weak, alpha equals 0.1 on a standardized metric. M has an effect on y and has sort of a relatively sizable effect, beta equals 0.4. And then there is a giant direct effect, x to y, 0.7. Using the standard methods of computing an indirect effect by taking the product, which is a perfectly legitimate method in linear models with continuous variables, get an indirect effect of 0.04, which, again, this is a standardized metric. It's pretty small and would probably not be significant unless you have gigantic sample size. What we can now also do is to ask the question, what if we, instead of estimating this model, we flip the arrow between m and y, let's say, and what would that result in? And here is that result. So here I've just flipped m and y, I've also repositioned them, but really the model is just one arrow being flipped, the one between m and y. And now suddenly I have an effect from x to y that used to be 0.70, that's now 0.74. I have a gigantic effect from y to m of 0.88, and I have now suddenly a negative indirect effect of negative 0.55, sorry, direct effect, and an indirect effect, alpha star times beta star of 0.65, which again on a standardized metric would probably be significant if only not in the tiniest of samples. So if I were to use the exact same logic that the authors of the psych science study have done, that I basically see, well, does my model work in one direction or another, I would very confidently, looking at these numbers here, choose the incorrect model. Again, this was one cherry-picked example, and I don't expect you to be convinced by just showing you one single data set. So what we did in the study is that we looked at every possible model that you can form with directed errors only. The only ones that I'm excluding are the ones that are cyclical, because they can be sort of excluded based on theoretical reasons. So these are all the models that one can form in the equivalence class without considering bidirected errors. So this is just a subset of the equivalence class. We also looked at the bidirected errors, but they didn't make it in the final paper. And what we now did is we said, let's just assume that model A, x and y, and x to y is the true model. And simulate some data from the true model, and then also examine model B, C, D, E, and F, these false models, and see how the indirect effect is being estimated in all. And in addition, and this is when I refer to as the whole universe, we varied alpha, beta, and gamma prime on a standardized metric on the complete universe that you can do. So it turns out on a standardized metric, there's certain implied correlation matrices, and obviously they can't exceed 1 or minus 1. And there are also certain combinations of correlations between 3 variables that are not possible. The whole universe, I'm sorry, this is not on this slide here. What we did is we then ended up picking values for alpha, beta, and gamma prime. And from those, using RIOTS tracing rules, we derived what the implied correlations are between these. And then once you have those in hand, you can actually, without having to simulate any data, derive, using the recursive formula, what would be the regression coefficients be that you would compute if you were to do a mediation analysis. This formula looks slightly complicated, but if you just sort of end up plugging all these things in here, then you realize that in this regular model here, A, the two paths that you're going to estimate in your mediation model are just alpha and beta. As probably everybody knows who's ever done sort of any type of mediation analysis. But what you can also then do is, again, you can derive this analytically, ask the question, if we generated data under model A and now analyze it model C, what would the alpha and beta path that I'm now computing, here alpha being x to y, and then beta being y to m, how would they look like? And you can again use this recursive formula and then arrive with that the indirect effect is going to be a product of alpha beta plus gamma prime times this giant ugly expression. And that will give you the analytically derived the indirect effect for a model in which you flip the arrow from m to y. And we do this for every single model. We do this for every value that is possible for these 3 path coefficients, which in 3-dimensional space looks like this. So on one axis we have alpha, the other beta, and then on the upper axis going upwards we have gamma prime. So these are all the possible values that you can pick. And you can see that in this 3-dimensional parameter space, there are certain combinations that you just can't pick because they would imply correlation matrices that are impossible. For example, having correlations that are larger than 1. We've also back translated these coefficients then on a correlation metric, and this is basically how the correlations between x and y, x and m and y look in 3-dimensional space. And we basically did a fine grid over all of these values and basically ran every single one of these models, which I forgot the exact number, but was somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. Of course, you can make this grid even finer and finer and finer, and then you technically have sort of an infinite number, but of course, eventually there's diminishing return on how fine you want to make this grid. So here is a set of histograms that show across this whole universe how big is the indirect effect. Here in the top left of the true model, and then all of these false models. And what you can immediately see is that all of these look pretty similar. So whether you have the true model or any of the false models, you mostly get indirect effects that are somewhat centered around 0, and then you get extrema and extrema effects sort of less frequently sort of further out. And of course, every type of sort of combination is possible in which the true has 0 and the false has a big effect, or vice versa. For this, we can look at some scatter plots here, in which on the x-axis is always the true effect, and then on the y-axis are the incorrect effects, and end up with sort of interesting looking patterns for some of these. You can also sort of zoom in on one single one, and then sort of ask yourself the question, if I were to use this decision rule, in that every time that the true effect is big and the false effect is 0, I sort of declare that I found it, and vice versa. You essentially sort of get these bands. So this green band here is a band in which the false effect is very, very close to 0 and probably insignificant. And in this middle of this green band here, you also have a true effect that is very close to 0. So here, as the authors in that psych science paper did, you will say, okay, you don't know which one to prefer. In these green regions out here, you would make the correct decision and prefer the true model. And then in the red region, which is where the true effect is very close to 0 and the false effect is big, you'd make an incorrect decision. And in all of these segments out here, you basically have big effects in both. And again, using that incorrect logic of the psych science authors would say that you cannot distinguish. And what we now did is we did this for every sort of combination and always asked the question, would a researcher make the correct decision, make an incorrect decision, or maybe declare them equivalent? And you end up with a graph like this. You can see that the correct decisions are at about 16-17%. And now recall that with 6 models, by chance, you would pick the correct model about 1/6, which is around 16.6%. So using this method of trying to use statistics and the significance of an indirect effect to adjudicate whether one model is preferable over the other basically gets you chance performance. There is sort of a big chunk of around 30 where you declare equivalence, where you basically say, I cannot decide between one or the other. And this is mostly due to the fact that there are many effects that are very, very close to 0 over this whole universe. Because as soon as you have either alpha or beta really, really close to 0, since you end up taking a product, the indirect effect is also going to be really close to 0. And then in about 50% of instances, you're going to make an incorrect decision. We basically say one model is preferable, even though it is not, because you know what the true model is. So that was sort of the best possible demonstration, where we said, if you look at all of these models and you look at the whole universe of parameter values that could be taken on, you're not going to be better than chance. So the key point is that reversing errors in mediation models does not distinguish equivalent models, and you cannot use statistical evidence alone to distinguish these models. It is simply impossible. But then, of course, the question that arises is there any way to make the equivalence class smaller? Is there any way for us to determine that maybe one model is preferable than the other? And the answer is yes. The way that we do this is by imposing structural knowledge that is based on either theory or research design. And when I use this term structural knowledge, what I mean is that we have some knowledge about the presence, absence, and direction of different arrows in these models. For example, you can ask yourself the question, was X randomized? And if it was, then you know that you can eliminate every single model that has an arrow going into X. Why? Because, well, if you randomize X, you basically force it to take on certain values, 0 or 1, or whatever you randomize over. It means that there is no other causal force other than you going into the system and twisting it that impacts X. That's why we all intuitively know why randomization is so powerful. As soon as you randomize, you can get rid of all of these models that have arrows going into X, which is a lot. It's a lot of models. You can try to make a case that X might be temporally and causally before M, or X before Y, or M before Y. You don't have a tool like randomization to do this, but you can make a theoretical argument. And as soon as you do this, you are allowed to eliminate all models that have directed arrows in the opposite direction. And lastly, can you assume that any pair of variables is unconfounded? And that is often a heroic assumption. But if you can make a case, if you can make a convincing case why you believe that to be true, you can eliminate all the bidirected arrows between the pair of variables that you assume to be unconfounded. On that last point, I want to quickly refer to two really important papers that came out, one in Psych Methods in 2010 by Koski Imai and colleagues and Judea Pearl, on what has been now referred to as causal mediation. What these papers did was, first of all, they used potential outcomes notation to define what are the true causal effects in the mediation model. That was sort of a novel contribution of both of these papers. That they essentially put the effects, such as the direct and the indirect effect that we have always been computing as psychologists in these models, on a firm footing in the causal inference literature. And secondly, they also spelled out exactly what kind of unconfoundedness assumptions I need to make in order to estimate unbiased causal direct and indirect effects. And they are essentially that you need to assume no confounding between x and m, that means no bidirected arrow, between m and y, and between x and y, basically every single pair. And then there's sort of a fourth additional assumption that is essentially subsumed in assumption number 2, that there's no confounder between m and y that is also caused by x. Now, these causal assumptions, and this is a caveat that I want to point out, to rule out some of these certain directional effects, are often plausible in longitudinal settings, but they are heroic in cross-sectional settings, or you might replace the word heroic with foolhardy. So you can make these assumptions and say that therefore the model that you have is sort of the true model, but the reader is not required to believe you. And if you just have cross-sectional data, then it's often just not very believable that some of these assumptions about directionality are plausible or not. Likewise, the causal assumptions to rule out confounding, the ones that I've just shown you in the papers by Imai and Pearl, they're very plausible. In fact, they are guaranteed to be true if you randomize stuff. But again, they're heroic if you just have observational data, which means that observational cross-sectional data is the most heroic or foolhardy to conduct a mediation analysis and expect other people to believe it. I should also point out that the relationship between the mediator and outcome is always observational. There is no simple design feature, such as randomization of x, that can causally identify the path between these two variables. There are some approaches. For example, you can try to find a so-called instrumental variable for m that is unrelated to y, but that's also very difficult. At one point, we made a little web application to try to help researchers to, first of all, think about the presence of the equivalence class, essentially raise awareness that when you do a mediation model, you actually also have equal support through a whole host of other models. And secondly, also to provide maybe a little tool. So here, what you see in front of you, it's a prototype, and we ended up actually never shipping it, even though it still exists on the web. These are the 27 models in the equivalence class that are estimable. I mentioned earlier to you that there are more of them. Those are basically the models in which you have both a directed arrow and a bidirected arrow, but these are not estimable from data. So here are only the 27 ones that you can estimate from data. And then you see in the top left here that we ask the researchers a couple of questions, such as, is X randomized? Yes, no. Or does X temporally causally precede M? Yes, no, don't know. And by answering these questions, the screen sort of updates and shows you these are still models that are plausible given the assumptions that you've given me. And as you can imagine, unless you know a lot and are willing to make a lot of assumptions, so basically don't have any don't knows, equivalence class is often going to be big. And an applied researcher who conducts a mediation analysis should be aware that there are these alternative models, that the researcher has no power over whether they are more or less plausible than any other model that was chosen. So no statistical test will help you, whether, let's say, model 3 or model 20 is the correct one. And again, we could have extended this also to ask the question, do you believe that the relationship between x and m is unconfounded, between m and y, and between x and y? And then we had 3 more extra questions, and we would have the whole 125 models. You could sort of see how those shrink and grow based on the assumptions that you're willing or unwilling to make. I was kind of heartened by the fact that this seemed to have a little bit of an impact. So here the editor, Roger Gino Sorolla at the University of Kent in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, wrote in his editorial that he used to have a policy in which every time a mediation model was submitted to JESP, that the authors needed to reverse the error, but this editorial suggestion was withdrawn. And again, I'll be honest with you, I haven't kept much track of whether people still do this a lot. Maybe this practice really has stopped and psychologists don't do this anymore. We're curious to hear if anybody has some experience or whether you still see this in the published literature or not. I want to close, and I know that I'm almost running out of time, and I just have a couple more points that I want to make. You might feel like, wow, there are all these assumptions that I need to make, and I can never sort of get at the true model unless I'm willing to make heroic assumptions. Is there sort of anything that would be able to bolster my faith? And the answer is yes, there is. You can, and maybe you should, conduct sensitivity analyses for the presence of unmeasured confounding. Sensitivity analysis is basically an analytical tool that allows you to probe assumptions about unmeasured confounding, allows you to construct a what-if scenario that is saying, yes, I am making the assumption that there is no confounding between, let's say, x and y, but I want to know what if there is, in fact. And we currently have a paper under review where we explain how to do these types of sensitivity analyses for these types of trivariate models, where we use the so-called phantom variable approach. Phantom variable approach is sort of a very flexible approach in structural equation models. It was developed by Rinskopf in 1984. There's a beautiful paper by Herring, McNeish, and Hancock, 2016, where they show how to use this type of approach for just sort of general regression models. And it can be very easily extended to these trivariate mediation type models. And the idea is that we essentially say, well, confounding between x and m, there could be because there is some unobserved variable u, or maybe even 1,000 unobserved variable u's who have jointly this effect on x and y. So we literally add an additional variable, but we fix its variance, we fix its covariance, we add no new information or degrees of freedom to the model, just basically forcing the model to be estimated under the presence of such a variable. And as I mentioned just a slide ago, it's essentially asking a what-if question, how parameters in an existing model would change if another variable was introduced. Here's a graph from this paper that is currently under review. See on the left, the y-axis, your estimate, and then on the x-axis, you see the sensitivity parameter here, basically saying there is some unobserved confounding between x and y. And just get my pen out here. And here, at this point, this is the estimate that you observe, because it is observed under the assumption that the confounding is 0. And then you can ask the question, well, what if my confounding is not 0, but it's, let's say, negative? And you would see that your estimate gets actually bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the gray region means significant. So confounding in a negative direction would not harm you. It will basically still yield the same frequentist conclusion of significance versus non-significance. You're basically making a type M error. You're underestimating the magnitude. But see what happens if this confounding between x and y would be positive. Very quickly, the effect ceases to be statistically significant. That's this region here. And if this confounding were to get even larger, then it gets significant in the opposite direction, and you're making a type S error, error of sign, which presumably would be sort of the most severe error. And that is how sensitivity analysis works. And you can do this obviously for one parameter of a time, but you can also ask the question, what if happens if both x and y and x and m and y are all confounded at the same time? And how big does this confounding need to be in order for me to make a wrong decision of either magnitude or sign? So I'm 2 minutes over, but in summary, I want to reiterate that the magnitude and the significance of any path coefficient or indirect effect is of no use to rule out equivalent models. Only qualitative, theoretical, causal assumptions can rule out alternative equivalent mediation models. With that, I'd like to end. I'd like to point out that you can contact me via email if any questions remain in the future. I'm also on Twitter, but to be honest, I hardly tweet, so there's not much use in following me. I'll stop my share. And be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really interesting, really great. Thanks for taking the time to walk through that.
Absolutely.
Super informative.
Absolutely.
So yes, if you have questions, add them to the Q&A or share your thoughts in the chat and things like that. We have one question here from Linda. Presumably this is also true exponentially so for larger and more complex path models as well.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. And yes, also exponentially. The equivalence class gets exponentially, just as you correctly said, bigger for all of these models. And it requires stronger and stronger assumptions that you're willing to make. So I can't even sort of, on the top of my head, compute how that would look like, let's say, for 4 variables or 5. But yes, it's absolutely true. And there's not a ton of awareness among applied researchers that every time they are constructing these complex models, there is a whole universe of other models that are just as supported. Now, I don't want to sort of sound too gloomy. There is, of course, often reason to believe that certain models are just sort of completely implausible, sort of on theoretical grounds, and we can dismiss them. But it is often true that there's at least a handful of models that would have very different theoretical implications that are both plausible. And I'm seeing the next question. When showing the simulation study, how do the causal assumptions of mediation models play into these simulations? So this is basically simulating linear models. Simulation itself was only linear models, just because it's easier to derive these things. It's also possible to do this with nonlinear models, but it's more effortful. It limits the generalizability of the results a little bit, but I don't think that it limits the overall applicability. So even if some of these path coefficients were, let's say, nonlinear, whether there was an XM interaction, or whether some of these things might be binary and we're using logistic models, same logic still applies. And sensitivity analysis, is this paper also detailing sensitivity analysis for mediation models that already include covariates? The answer is no. The paper just really sort of explains how one can engage in these types of sensitivity analysis using the phantom variable approach. So no covariates included in that yet. So I guess I can click answer live. I've never used this type of Zoom feature, so it's very interesting. Very cool. Judith asks, if I get asked to reverse the indirect effect, I will know how to reply to that. I think at this point you can reply that you're not going to do it. So if an editor asks you to reverse, or a reviewer asks you to reverse the model, you tell them that, and of course a slightest possible way that reversing errors does not help in distinguishing a true model from a false model. And then you can cite McKinnon 2000, Fiedler 2000, or if you like, you can also cite Thomas 2015. The tool, whether I can share this, it's really just a prototype. I guess I can put it in the chat because it does still exist. Yeah, I'll show you. So it's still live, and it still sort of does the things that it was supposed to do. And I'll just put this. Stop the share, and let's see. Go to type answer and send it. I think the tool, though, it should be extended to also ask these questions about unconfoundedness assumptions and show you the full equivalence class, even the models that are not estimable. And I didn't talk about it much in the talk, but the reason why these models, where you, let's say, have say x, m, y, but you also assume that there might be a bidirected arrow on top of x and m, a bidirected arrow on m and y, why these models didn't show up, because you can't estimate these models. So if you have data on x and y and say, well, I think this is the true model in which these paths exist and all of these bidirected paths also exist, you don't have enough degrees of freedom. So you can't estimate these models. They're not, as we say, identifiable from data alone. That doesn't mean that they can't be true. There's also another thing. I can obviously simulate data with all of these arrows and then give you these three variables, and you will be unable to estimate the model that includes all of these arrows because you're missing these unobserved variables u that I used in my little computer world to generate these bidirected arrows. Linda asked as a follow-up, is this an argument for constructing strictly a priori theory-driven models and testing to determine if data is consistent without exploratory models and without strong causal claim? That makes sense. I think it makes sense. And I think if you are talking about mediation models,
I think we might have a small connection issue. Let's wait a minute and hope it resolves.
I couldn't tell if that was me.
Oh,
you're
I'm
back.
back.
Okay.
I have no idea when I cut off, though. I kept talking about Linda's question.
Yeah, just perfectly in the middle of your answer to Linda's question.
Okay, just in the middle of it. So yes, Linda, I agree with you that when you're looking at these path models, that they should be theory-driven because you are making assumptions. Again, whether you realize it or not, you are making assumptions by eliminating these alternative causal models. However, again, I want to also make the case that I'm not saying that I don't value exploratory models. There is value in descriptive work, but structural equation models or mediation models as one incantation of, let's say, a structural equation models are not the tool for exploratory work. Yeah, I think it's my computer. It's reacting very slowly when I sort of trying to click done on these things. So it's probably on me, sorry. Paul is asking a question, is it fair to say that as much time should be focused on theoretical learning and equally importantly context-specific learning to research questions, just as much as the statistical learning when considering mediation causality? Yes. So every time that you seek out to identify a causal effect in any type of setting,
Things will happen at the start of every question.
oh, I'm back.
You're back again.
Yeah, this is definitely my computer. I apologize for it. And luckily, this only happened towards the end. So just in the last 5 minutes. So was I just in the middle of answering Paul's question again?
You had just started to answer, yeah.
I just started. Okay. So Paul asked, should we be focused on theoretical learning and context-specific learning to research questions just as much as statistical learning? Yes. So if I understand the question correctly, Paul, whenever you seek out to answer a causal question, either in the context of a mediation model or even more simply in the context of there's a putative cause X and an outcome of interest Y, and you want to get at the causal effect, thinking about the causal assumptions is maybe even more important than what kind of statistical model you end up using. Or differently formulated, you can say that the causal thinking of sort of thinking about what causal effect am I estimating and how can I estimate it informs then what kind of statistical model you end up using. So yes, absolutely important. I'll try to click this, but I'm afraid that maybe somebody else should do the clicking.
Yeah,
I wanted to click answer live and then done, but it seems like that's sort of what my computer doesn't like. But that's a really cool feature of Zoom that I was not aware of yet.
That's nice, and people can upvote them and stuff. I think it's just for the webinars though. So I have a question actually that will follow up on both of those two questions that you just answered. And I think that it has to do with determining whether or not you have either good reasons to think that things work temporally, or you determine that these are what you would call theoretical reasons. And the problem that I struggle with often, and when I talk to people or students ask me, how they should analyze this, is that people often say that they have theoretical reasons for testing this particular direction of a model, yet they want to use the results of that mediation model to support that reason. And it sounds cyclical to me.
Yes.
And I wonder how we can distinguish between those sort of either the terminology or what we're actually doing there. And how do we respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I totally get sort of the cyclical, this feeling of the cyclical nature. It is also sort of weird, right? That we say, okay, we have this theoretical model. Now we find sort of this effect, but that doesn't mean that our model is true. So that doesn't follow from that. Because as I've shown you earlier, you could have some true model, but then you estimate a different model and it shows you a significant effect. And then from that thinking that, oh, now I found evidence that this model is true, it doesn't follow. So really, your only way out, as as depressing as this may sound, is not statistical evidence, but causal assumptions that you're willing to defend. And people can choose not to believe you on these theoretical assumptions. This is sort of, it's the same question of, let's say you have a non-randomized study. You have some cause X and some outcome, but it wasn't randomized. And you want to make the claim that this effect is still an unbiased causal effect estimate. And you can say, I've controlled for this and for this, and people still might say, well, but we still don't believe you because there might be this that you have overlooked. And that is the same, but even more complicated for the mediation models. That you can try to make these claims, but people can rightfully come back and say, no, this other model is just as supported as the model that you favored. So yeah, it feels very strange, right? That you say, okay, I have this theoretical model, and yes, I've seen the significant effect success. You haven't ruled out the alternatives. You just haven't. As sad as it sounds.
Well, this is obviously one of our goals is right, to determine things that cause things in psychology. And I think it's a difficult problem for us to learn how to design our studies and get the right kind of data to answer these questions. You mentioned several times through your talk how common these kinds of things are. And one example I like to share is I published a paper that finally came out in 2019. in which I test all kinds of different directions because I was asked to.
Yeah.
In my defense, we actually did that probably in late 2017.
Yeah,
But
perfectly
yeah,
fine.
it happens a lot.
And it's not that we're sort of completely helpless. I mean, randomizing X goes a long way to rule out a ton of models. And then it can sometimes be convincing to say, look, I've randomized X, can rule out the bidirected errors between X and M and X and Y by design. I can rule out any directed errors into X. And then I really just need to argue that it is reasonable to believe that M is causally prior to Y. And then I'm ruling out even more models. And then the last remaining issue that I have is that of potential confounding between M and Y. Maybe for that I can do a sensitivity analysis. And then I have pretty good arguments in hand that this XMY model that I thought about all along might be a defensible model. So on the other hand, if you have cross-sectional observational data, you're having a much, much harder time to convince people that this is reasonable. And you certainly cannot say, hey, it's significant, therefore it must be true. You can't. So
If
I
you
wonder if one of the we're getting. Oh yeah, go for it. Sorry.
So I just have a quick question to follow
Yes.
up on that actually, because I do, so for my PhD dissertation, I did like randomize X, but that was the beginning of all this conversation about mediation.
Yeah.
So I was shy to do the mediation analysis, even though I do have a X was randomized
Yeah.
component. Well, so one thing is, the reason that I also hesitate is because my research was built on, we know that it's a pretty strong theoretical framework like the self-determination theory. But my struggle was that I look at the literature and a lot of it also built on, a lot of the mediation analysis was built on SEM with cross-sectional observational data. So if your theory is built majority from mainly cross-sectional observation SEM models, can you claim that you have a theoretical framework for your mediation analysis?
Well, you're certainly right to question how strong the foundations of those things. And again, there might be good reasons to believe that even though it's cross-sectional, that there should be this particular order, but it's probably very shaky foundations. I don't know if this is a satisfactory answer, but if there's sort of a whole body of literature that is all based on cross-sectional mediation, that's not a strong foundation. It just isn't. Yeah.
That was my question. Sorry, John.
No, it's fine. Yeah. Well, we're right on the hour.
Yep, right on time.
Take up any more time, but I think that those are some great questions and a really interesting talk. So thanks so much for
again. It was my pleasure to be here. I was delighted to receive the invitation and happy that I had the opportunity to talk to you about this today. So greetings to Durham or wherever you're calling in from, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks very much. Take care.
All right. Bye for now.
Good morning.